Good evening. Welcome to the Historic Review Board work session this evening, Tuesday, November 19th. We're going to call it to order at this time, and please take roll.
Board Member Lawrence.
Present.
Board Member Green.
Present.
Vice Chair Powell.
Present. All righty, let's move on to Christina.
Thank you, Chair Powell. This evening we have
Assistant City Attorney Carrie Richter, who will provide a little background of the latest housing bills that have come through the legislature over the last couple of years and kind of give an assessment of where we are and how we anticipate adhering to them and meeting those standards as we move forward. I think Carrie has a presentation. Probably at some point you can a little bit of a presentation, but also ask questions. So I'll kind of give it to Carrie to kind of lay out how she wants to best provide the information, but still have an open conversation.
Okay.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Carrie Richter. I am the Deputy City Attorney. I haven't met many of you, but some familiar faces. So I've been asked to give you a little bit of a legislative update. It's kind of odd to do a legislative update in December because the legislature convenes in January, but I'm going to give you sort of what has happened over the last couple of years and the way the city has responded, and then a little bit about what the city is doing right now in response to some legislative changes, and then if you want, we can talk a little bit about what's going to happen in the next session as far as I know it. I want this to be an iterative conversation, so I'm going to sort of stop after each slide and give you an opportunity to weigh in and talk about your perspective and ask me questions, and hopefully we'll have a good conversation. Do we have anybody online? Okay. All right, so let's see if I can make this work. So, as you all probably know, Oregon's in a housing crisis, right? In the 1970s, the number of housing starts in Oregon hovered around 36,000 per year. But the last time more than 30,000 building permits were issued was in 2005, before the Great Recession. In 2010, 6,868 permits were issued. There are many reasons cited for this shortfall, and one of them that is often cited is restrictive housing laws. National shortage of builders, raising material costs, stagnant incomes, and high property taxes. This lack of supply has significantly increased housing costs, creating a barrier for entry for all income levels. Oregon ranks among states with the lowest supply of rental housing that is affordable to people at or below poverty rates. What I was interested to know, we've been sort of in this bold new experience of removing housing laws since about 2017. And since 2017, we still haven't seen a dramatic rise in housing starts. In 2003, the number was 17,700, so we're still, half of where we need to be. And for the first 6 months of 2004, the number was 7,300. So if we double that, we're still only at 14,000. We're still not close. So there's a lot of reasons to address, ways to address this situation, and one of the ways that the state has decided to address it is to address barriers to the construction of housing by preempting local governments in their ability to regulate housing. And it's across the board in every area, and so we've got to get more housing. And that's what all of this legislation is aimed at doing. So in 2017, we saw the first of these bills. For many years, decades in fact, there has been a rule on the books that says when you are building needed housing, you have to review it subject to clear and objective standards. Clear and objective standards are standards that are non-discretionary. So building height is 35 feet. Measurable standards, setbacks are 10 feet. Historic review criteria are not clear and objective, right? Because we're interested in understanding context, significance, integrity, all those kinds of evaluative, qualitative determinations. So for decades, when you're reviewing an application for needed housing, you can only subject it to clear and objective standards. But needed housing was defined to mean affordable housing, low-income housing, manufactured housing, housing that you've identified a shortfall in your needed housing inventory. So every 10 years, local governments do this projection of how much housing they're going to need. And if they fall short, then that is needed housing. Because local governments do a good job with that planning, they're not short when they do these studies very often. So this time when clear and objective standards applied was fairly irregular, didn't come up very much. And so we went forward for decades with this clear and objective on the books. So in 2017, we get a change to the law that expands the obligation to apply only clear and objective standards to all housing. So it's not needed housing anymore. I mean, it's still, the word is still needed housing, but the term is defined now to mean all housing. And so that becomes the law of the land. There's an exception for historic review. And that's built into the law. It says review for historic designation does not have to be subject to clear and objective standards. So that's why the city has gone through many code iterations to make it clear and objective in all areas except for historic preservation, because that can still stay discretionary. Then we move forward to House Bill 2001 in 2019, and then a corollary in 2021 that mandates middle housing. And when I say middle housing, you know what I'm talking about, right? Duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, essentially getting rid of single-family zoning and eliminating sort of that idea of we're going to constrain things by density. We're going to instead open it up and allow much greater housing types in our single-family residential zones. So these middle housing standards are laws, so we have to allow them, and then there are rules that were adopted by the Department of Land Conservation and Development that say exactly how local governments have to implement the middle housing obligations in the metro region. And one of those, as it comes to historic preservation, it says that local governments can regulate historic resources differently when it respect to middle housing, but local governments can't treat those middle housing units differently than it would single-family housing units. So you could have an obligation that you have only one door facing a street, you know, so you have that look. But you couldn't prohibit a duplex that, say, had a door that was at the rear. Does that distinction make sense? So again, we've got a sort of good carve out here for historic preservation. We're able to still do the context analysis necessary to ensure compatibility and integrity of our historic districts, right? Questions about that so far?
Well, of course, it's a thorny issue, the middle housing thing. But one I think that we would bump up frequently against would be massing, in that typically the historical houses are smaller. So how do you treat this duplex or triplex and keep it within the context of the historical district size-wise. Does that mean that essentially that building, if it's 3 units in one building, essentially matches the size and massing of the single family in the district? I mean, which makes sense from an appearance standpoint, but pretty much effectively eliminates middle housing, because how do you unless they're little micro apartments or something like that. But would that be the appropriate application?
My understanding of the way this would work is that if you would deny that triplex, if it were a single-family house because of its massing, just set aside that it's 3 families. If you would say that massing in its scale and form is inconsistent with the district, then the answer is yes, you deny it.
Okay.
If you would say, well, if this was a single-family house, it would be okay, then you can't deny it because it is a triplex.
Sure.
But I would encourage the board to keep in mind whether there would be a way to achieve a triplex, duplex situation with a different massing or standalone buildings, freestanding buildings. Maybe one loads in the back, so it looks maybe like a carriage house or something like that. But being creative with massing and form in order to accommodate middle housing, I think would be where I would encourage the board to go.
And we have adopted design guidelines for middle housing that allow slightly more than 100%. I think we're 1.5 of the massing of the nearest couple of historic resources. So there is a nod that is slightly bigger, but you're still looking at a single family home volume as the ideal kind of standard by which you are looking at the ideal form.
Isn't there other issues at hand, though, that include parking, vehicle storage, egress, sidewalk? I mean, a lot of issues with the massing's one part of it, but you have also, and if you have a 3-plex, every 3rd house, there's more to it than just the massing issue, right?
Sure, I mean, potentially you have parking issues, obviously, and we never talked, I don't know that we talked about that when we talked about middle housing.
Parking is not really, if they are proposing a parking pad on the site, because you're looking at the aesthetics and compatibility. If the design standards allow just citywide not to require parking in that situation based on where it's located, that can't be a reason for denial, right?
Well, so setbacks, that's the other thing that concerns me a little bit, because, a lot could come back on us on setbacks, because if you've got a single-family house with a 20-foot or 10-foot setback and a 5-foot on each side, or however it works, it's going to be hard to put triplex, into that same floor plan. And if it's a matter of just, pushing out or taking back a little bit of the front or the back or the side, is that still something that we have authority over? If somebody were to come in and say, well, it'll fit, but we need to get a 5-foot setback instead of a 10-foot setback.
They would need a variance.
So they just apply for a variance, which we could review or not.
Yeah, and I think that's a great conversation. Let's wait till the end with as we talk about the newest Senate bills and what the kind of waiver opportunities, but I think maybe we can talk some examples through as we get to the end of the presentation. I think those are great questions.
Okay.
Okay, and then quickly, the third bill I want to talk to you about is Senate Bill 8, which requires allowing affordable housing on land zoned commercial or that allows religious uses without a zone change or conditional use permit up to the stated densities. So this might come up. You don't have commercial in your historic districts.
7th Street, but not a lot.
But a church, for example, that you have in a residential zone could become affordable housing without requiring any sort of review. So just so you're aware of that. So jumping forward, Governor Kotek takes office, one of her very first actions is to implement Executive Order 2304, which establishes a housing production goal of 36,000 homes per year. So we're gonna just amp, what we were doing before, sort of slow rolling it, now we're gonna just amp it up. And so she created the Housing Production Advisory Council, which was a group of land use planners and developers and builders and a couple of lawyers, and they got together and held a number of hearings to identify what it would take to build 36,000 houses a year. And they made 59 recommendations that then came out in a formal, lengthy report that then is serving as essentially a blueprint for the governor to sort of address this. And it's not just land use regulations, it's coordination with the building code, it's training up more building inspectors, it's streamlining different agency offices so that DEQ is talking to DSL, and so wetland review is happening more efficiently. I mean, it's a really holistic look at how to get building permits processed more quickly. So as part of these recommendations, the subsequent agreement was to allow for a one-time UGB expansion for affordable and market rate housing under certain circumstances, and loan support. So there's a robust grant program that's supposed to do things not just for the building of affordable housing or low-income housing, but also funding infrastructure to build roads and pump stations to help facilitate these building permits. So jumping forward to Senate Bill 1537. So this is the big land use bill that passed last year that attempts to get at a number of these Housing Production Advisory Council recommendations. And this is a 42-page bill. It covers a lot of things, and I'm going to just summarize for you what it covers before we get into the mandatory adjustment part. Okay, first it creates the Housing Accountability Office, and they call this the HAPO. It's Housing Accountability and Production Office, that's the P, right? And it joins the Department of Land Conservation and Development and the Building Codes Division to assist in the implementation of these new housing laws. And that the goal is to provide technical and financial assistance to local governments in their planning efforts, as well as investigation of complaints and enforcement. So as of right now, until HAPO was created, there wasn't really an enforcement arm from the state with respect to land use regulations. You could file an enforcement complaint with the Department of Land Conservation and Development, and the outcome would be that the local government has to go implement regulations to solve the problem. For example, Washington County was in a Goal 5 situation with respect to their natural resources enforcement action a couple of years ago. So Washington County had to just adopt a moratorium on development in those areas. Well, it rushed ahead and adopted the regulations that it needed to. The way HAPA works is potentially much more draconian. It allows HAPO, theoretically, if a local government refused to comply, to step in and do zoning for the local government. So it's a whole nother, it's a bigger hammer, if you will. And, but it also comes with a lot of support too. I mean, there's a lot of opportunities for HAPO to help step in and help a local government engage in the revisions to regulations that HAPO deems necessary. And the other thing that HAPO's going to do that I'm really excited about is that they're going to start tracking housing starts and start tracking housing production. Right now, Housing Goal 10, which is the statewide land use goal that relates to housing, requires local government to project its land need and its housing need, but it doesn't require it to really calculate how many housing starts it has and what types of housing is getting built and where it's getting built. And I think that there's a real opportunity here for places like Oregon City to really lean into adaptive reuse as a strategy, as a legitimate affordable housing strategy, where, you know, if Oregon City could incentivize some adaptive reuse where your house is more than 50 years old, if you stay in it, we'll, you know, and you build maybe an addition rather than tearing down your house and building a new house, maybe you get reduced system development charges, or maybe there's additional density, or maybe there's a grant program, but there's a way to, I think I hope that HAPO will reward and acknowledge more historic cities like Oregon City or Astoria or places like that, that have a supply of historic housing stock, which is more affordable than new housing for moderate income people. We'll be able to track that and be able to really give it some validity, because I don't think we're really tracking, the state hasn't really tracked that, you know, how many houses are demolished and how many houses are built in their place, and perhaps the energy consequences of that. So anyway, this whole more robust tracking system through HAPO, I think, has potential to be a really positive thing.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's traffic, but there's so much involved on my side that, you know, we have to do. But the question I have about, how about ADUs? Are ADUs, as you say, housing? ADU's a house, so does that count towards the goal?
Yes, and you know, the whole idea with ADUs and middle housing is that you're spreading the cost of the land and the cost of construction out among more people. So theoretically, it gets less expensive when you're sharing that resource.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, if you have a relatively open ADU policy where you can, if you have a yard, a lot big enough that you could put an ADU onto it, that's where I think is a great idea, to be able to get some sort of a discount on the planning or whatever. But that makes sense.
You have anything to add on that?
No, I mean, the one thing in Oregon City, ADUs actually technically aren't middle housing. It was just how the state wanted to identify it. But we allow detached duplexes in Oregon City when one of the homes is 5 years or older. And so that it basically acts like an ADU.
Yeah.
But we call it a detached duplex. And it gets to be a little bit larger than the confines of an ADU max square footage.
Yeah, and ADU is just the buzzword. It's going. I mean, everybody's doing ADU, and yeah, I mean, you got the guy down here that's putting shipping containers together and says we build ADUs right on the freeway, right? So that's going to be a challenge.
Okay. Now I'm going to move on to the main event, I think, which, you know, what you all came for. I can't move this forward. Gracias. Okay, so Section 35 of Senate Bill 1537 is the mandatory adjustment piece. And the idea here is that developers are coming with projects to local governments, and the regulations are clear and objective, right? Because that's what we've just been talking about. And that clear and objective requirement is just not compatible with the design that this developer needs. They need to reduce the setback. They need to reduce the number of parking spaces. They need to increase the height. And so the local government says, well, you need to reduce the setback, you've got to go get a variance. You want to have less on-street parking, you have to go get a variance. And so an applicant goes and gets a variance, and that takes time, and variances are subject to discretionary criteria, and so developers can't predict whether they're going to get it or not, and that is a barrier to the production of housing. And there is the example that was used a lot. There was an affordable housing multifamily project in Troutdale that didn't have enough off-street parking, and they needed a variance, and it took 2 years to go through the process. And that was viewed as a barrier to housing. So what we need to do is we need to have a procedure and standards that are modest adjustments that are mandatory, and local governments must grant them. And so when an applicant is proposing a density of not less than 17 dwelling units per acre, which converts to about a 2,500 square foot minimum lot size,
Or a duplex on 5,000 square feet.
or a duplex or triplex on 5,000 square feet, because that would achieve this 2,562 square foot minimum, right? So where an applicant proposes a density at that level, and they're adding new housing units in new construction projects, they are eligible for one of these mandatory, some amount of mandatory adjustments. It's important that you understand that the word is new housing units in new construction projects. So if I have a historic building, a historic home in Kenema, and I'm gonna put an internal ADU inside of it, I don't get a mandatory adjustment for that, because it's not new construction. And it's not new housing in a new construction project. So this is like vacant land built on. Additions don't count. Okay? As a historic preservation advocate, I worked really hard on that phrase, new housing and new construction, in an effort to protect existing landmarks from these mandatory adjustments. So there's, in case you want to know, there's all kinds of legislative history on that. The applicant, when they file an adjustment application, as part of their application, in addition to being, 17 dwelling units per acre density and being new housing on a new construction project, an applicant has to state that the adjustment does one of these things. It makes feasible an otherwise unfeasible development, reduces the sale rental price of the unit, increases the number of units in the application, will allow all units to be subject to an affordable housing covenant, will allow 20% of units to be affordable to low income, increases accessibility or visibility features, and is subject to zero equity, limited equity, or shared equity ownership model. So an applicant has to make some kind of statement that one of these factors is true. What's important about this is it is a statement. It doesn't have to be verified. And there is no opportunity for a local government to verify that statement or to require a certain level of proof with that statement.
So for instance, if an applicant came in and said, okay, by utilizing this configuration, maybe it adds a unit or whatever, it's going to reduce the sale prices of my units 5%. So it really isn't going to be challenged.
Correct.
If he says it's going to replace it 5%, then that's the criteria that he's using to get the automatic adjustment.
Yep, and he doesn't have to say it's 5%.
Okay.
He's saying it reduces the feasibility of my project. It reduces the sales price of my project. I mean, there is no barrier to entry here on that score.
Yeah.
Right, the barrier to entry really is going to be the 17 dwelling units per acre. So you're not going to get this with a single-family house on a 5,000 square foot lot.
Right.
Okay, so we have an applicant who wants to reduce the side yard setback and wants to increase the building height and doesn't want to use wood siding because it costs too much and doesn't want to meet the transparency design standards, for example. Those are all items that are included and eligible for adjustment. The bill itself sets forth a long list of design standards and development standards. Development standards are things like the orientation of the building, things like parking, things like setbacks. Those are development standards. Bicycle parking, those are development standards. Design standards are what it's made out, what the building's made out of, you know, the design. Okay? It's important to know that Senate Bill 1537, this mandatory adjustment, does not have a carve-out for historic preservation. I should have said that at the beginning. There is no exception.
No.
So I'll give you what I think is the list of, I brought a copy of the bill. We can go through each of the potential adjustments, but I've given you what I think are the most likely to be pursued in the historic arena. And you get 10 distinct adjustments. So you get 10 at a time.
Wow.
Jeez.
So you can reduce the height and rear yard setback of no more than 10%. You can eliminate the parking minimum standards. You can reduce the minimum, reduce the minimum lot size, the lot width and depth standards to not more than 10%. So you could make a lot 10% smaller. You could make the width smaller and the depth smaller by 10%. You cannot prohibit ground floor residential in a mixed-use project. And building height can be increased 1 story or 20% of the base zone height. So what does that mean in Kanema, Christina?
Well, it would be the 35 feet, which is the base zone. But this, I mean, this is I think the conversation I'll have is the board often restricts the final height of the building because of the 1.5-story requirement of vernacular or the massing issue that comes out of a taller building.
So how are we going to translate a 1.5-story design standard to a 20% increase, is what you're saying?
Mm-hmm.
Or 1 story.
Of the underlying zone.
Right.
So then, for instance, the design standards that specify smooth siding or 6-inch siding or whatever it may be within the design standards, if there's no carve-out for historic preservation, the applicant could say, well, it's going to be cheaper to use 8-inch hardy plank and so.
Textured.
And vinyl windows.
Yep.
We just lost our job.
Well, so on the design standard front, to your point, facade materials, color, pattern, out the window. Facade articulation, out the window. Roof form and materials, out the window. Window materials, out the window, literally. Total window area, you can be adjusted up to 30%. And then building orientation, height transition, balcony and porch recesses, offset requirements for multifamily and mixed use. So,
That still only applies if it's that high density, correct?
so yes, so it
So in
only
other words-
applies to the duplex on
Right.
a 5,000 square foot lot.
Then all of a sudden, basically, the design standards are gone. But with the traditional density, this doesn't apply.
Single-family residential,
Yeah, yeah,
and only new construction of new houses.
correct, correct. And probably it will functionally then, I would say, guess only apply in McLaughlin, because I think probably everything left in Kenema is in the geological hazards overlay. And so that enhanced density can't be,
In some areas. So yeah, a lot of Kenema is correct. It's 2 units per acre if you are in the historic landslide or the buffer area. So we would, there are some odd areas that are out of the geologic hazards, but yeah, if you are a lot, a 5,000 square foot lot, that may be the case, that you can't get the extra unit, but we're still kind of walking through that question.
yeah.
So I don't know how you apply these 20% to design guidelines. I don't know. And I hope we're not the first to test it.
We're really busy in court.
Well, they don't lend themselves. They were built to be adjustments to clear and objective standards. And if you had a clear and objective standard that says building height has to be 35 feet, then an additional 20% is easily calculable.
Right.
But this is, we've got the historic preservation world of discretionary design guidelines that are very context sensitive. And they're coming against a buzzsaw that is not that way.
Yeah.
And, I don't have a good answer for you on that.
Yeah,
All I can tell you is what the law says.
sure.
And when we're confronted with it, we're going to do the best we can to apply the law accurately and appropriately, but we're also going to try to protect the district because they're historic resources that are entitled to protection under state law. So that's the best I can tell you on that front.
Did SHPO get involved in all this? Were they at the table and having these discussions, or that was never brought up?
No, SHPO is not a land use agency. SHPO is a designation, National Register,
Right.
Park Service entity. It doesn't get involved in land use regulation per se because it implements a, National Register program that allows for federal incentives. It doesn't deal in this area as much as it seems obvious to you and me that they should be.
Right.
They're also not an advocacy group. They're here to help implement state law, right? And federal grants and requirements that come down from the National Park Service. So I think they were involved in any clarification, but this went through the legislative political process through our elected officials.
So there was a lot of, so I testified a lot. I'm the Policy and Advocacy Committee Chair for Restore Oregon, the statewide historic preservation organization. So we did a lot of testimony, a lot of other historic preservation advocates did. The problem with historic preservation is that it's such a small component of resources. It's less like 1% of all houses. And so you know, we don't have the lobbying power that natural resources do, for example, because when this originated, it was going to apply to, you know, mandatory adjustments for tree removal, for, you know, prohibiting tree protection regulations or natural resource protections, and that was all carved out, and so those regulations stay in place untouched. But it was only because of the lobbying force of the natural resource advocates that made that a reality. Okay, I know we're running out of time, and I've got one last slide. And this is the adjustment procedures. I mentioned that it does not allow deviations from tree, wildlife, natural resource, Willamette River Greenway, or natural hazard protections. Building or fire code requirements stay in place, but it does apply to historic resources. A city can decide what procedure it wants to use when it's processing these, either a type 1 or type 2. And the process does not need to include notice to neighbors, so it won't come before the HRB. Type 2 process is a staff decision that is appealable to City Commission.
So question though, because if you have a new construction in McLaughlin, that would normally go to the Historic Review Board, and then we have these mandatory adjustments, which are type 2. Is it one of the things where I would come to the board and say, the following things are off the table?
Yes.
We are looking at only these things tonight?
Correct. I think that's the way it would shape out.
So it's a bit of a filtration process.
The things that the applicant has requested, the 10 distinct adjustments, those would be off the table for consideration.
I know we have some time, but the one thing that I don't see in all of this is this massing question, which I know that Board Member Green brought up, and so much of what we do is massing oriented, but it plays out through things like height and setbacks. So the interplay between us saying this building is too big, the massing is wrong, it is an interesting puzzle, because you can still come up with this massing is too big, but you have these mandatory adjustments you've already been forced to give.
That have the effect of making the mass what it is, right? Reducing the setback, increasing the height, is what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
But the discretionary piece is still in place, is it not?
Well,
In other words, you almost make a discretionary, you know, benchmark and say, okay, 20% bigger than this, which is kind of a moving target, but I mean.
well, I think you're thinking from a practical standpoint, which I think is what you know, LUBA would reward. Mm-hmm. You would say, okay, vernacular style structures are this big, and we're going to let you go 20% bigger in every direction.
Yeah.
And we're going to call that the mandatory adjustment.
Which we're kind of baked in with the middle housing deal, with essentially one and a half times the traditional housing. So it becomes kind of a nomenclature issue, maybe even. So.
Is there any, sorry, I came in a little bit later, is there any pushback with this? I mean, in terms of, are we allowed to define anything on our side?
Well, I think you can, you know, there may be some opportunities to provide some greater definition into the 10 distinct adjustments. The attempt there with the drafters was to set them out, so it wasn't just a free-for-all, and to make it clear exactly what could be adjusted and to what degree. So, you know, I mean, maybe there might be some room to do impose some additional constraints with respect to definitions, but I haven't really gotten into that. What you need to know, what is very pertinent right now, is that this Section 35, the mandatory adjustment provisions allow, if you don't want to impose these mandatory adjustments, you as a local government can apply to be exempt from the mandatory adjustment obligations. If the city files an application by January 1st, upcoming, and explains that it has approved 90% of the variances requested over the last 5 years. If it submits data to show that that is the case, then HAPO, this government office, will exempt Oregon City from this mandatory adjustment obligation. And so I am working with the planning office to file that application. If you file that application by January 1st, you do not have to process mandatory adjustments while HAPO is reviewing your application. So it is not the case that on January 1st, the city is going to have to all of a sudden start granting these. There is going to be, I believe we're gonna put together an application and we're gonna file it. I think we have good reason to believe that the city has granted 90% of the variances over the last 5 years. So again, we're trying to show that Oregon City is not standing in the way of the governor's housing objectives. And assuming we can show that, we have every reason to believe that it will be granted. And then, the last 30 minutes of my presentation will become a nullity. Fingers crossed. But we don't know.
Yeah.
I vote yes.
Thanks.
Okay, so anything else? Any other questions? Comments? Criticisms? Jokes?
What's the point?
It seems awfully one-sided. I mean, I get the idea. I know we need more housing. I get all that, but clear and objective on our part, but whatever you want on the other side. It just doesn't seem reasonable.
Well, developers are reasonable, so it won't.
Well, developer would never do that, I'm sure.
This has been a one where these clear and objective makes perfect sense for the rest of the city and how we do it. And it is like one tool, it's a tool used for the wrong situation. And it's hard to translate the two because they exist in two different worlds and how we approach things.
It really seems like a way that we're going to lose a lot and gain very little.
Yeah, this seems like a slippery slope. It's an entry to a slippery slope.
Like Disney World,
Yeah, and once you open up that Pandora's box, it's gonna...
So, for those of you who are interested, the governor's office just shared their legislative concept for a 2025 session. And it instructs DLCD to implement rulemaking to eliminate demolition review in historic districts and of landmarks.
Project 20.
And to take a close look at the discretionary standards that apply to historic resources.
Can I ask you if there's a precedent for this anywhere?
Constraining historic preservation like this, or
No,
just?
this in particular sort of, yes, this is a conservative constraint, so.
I think many states are trying to figure out how to get more housing built. The housing crisis is a legitimate problem in Oregon, and it's a legitimate problem across the country. And so many states and local governments are trying different ways to get more housing built.
What about vacant and abandoned properties?
you know, again, that's one of those things that if HAPO starts counting vacant land and we can get down into, I think, really incentivizing the development of vacant properties and the adaptive reuse of existing properties, which is the most environmental, sustainable, affordable approach, I'm optimistic that we can get there. But you know, it's a big problem, and we're gonna take everything, you know, the state is gonna take every opportunity to constrain local governments in order to get this going.
I find it interesting, your comment about the force of lobbying, because even though the historic preservation voice is small, the historic preservation target is small. You know, half of the developable land is going to deal with trees and natural resources and a lot of those issues, and a very, very small percentage of the buildable land for new construction is going to be in historic districts and so forth. So, I mean, I get the concept that everybody's going to want to carve out their piece, and so if everybody gets to carve out their piece, you haven't accomplished anything. I get that concept, but the fact that we're going to carve out this little 0.5% piece is interesting, because it potentially it potentially removes a lot of protection for a very small amount of gain, which is kind of
Right,
unfortunate.
I think so too, yeah.
We need Christmas trees, not historic buildings.
So,
Okay.
All right, sorry I don't have better news,
Well, thank you for,
but keep fighting the good fight and
Yeah.
keep at it. And if you have any other questions, my email address is on that last slide, but Christina also is very knowledgeable about what's going on in Salem too, so ask her, and we'll continue to do the best we can.
great.
All right?
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much, Carrie.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Okay, thank you very much. We're going to close the work session now and take a 5-minute break so we can get things set up for the next meeting. Is that okay? All right. Thank you very much.
Great.
You guys?
Recording stopped.